I want to begin the session today with a visual aid I found in a favorite set of reference books that I have from when I was a rabbinical student in Jerusalem. And I just need to pull up screen share. So we're going to this page, and I'm going to zoom in here for you. So let's see. So I'm gonna, in the chat box, if you could just write a word or two about what you see in this image. So I will read to you. Don't worry about whether your working academic Hebrew is good enough to read any of the caption above this image about what this artifact is. Just sort of whatever you see. There are no wrong answers. I mean, there are maybe less accurate answers to what we know about this artifact, but I'm just curious in the chat box for you to write a word or two, even a phrase about what you see in this image. Trying to get it to sort of fit my screen. So I am not an Egyptologist, by the way. I'm a rabbi with some background in the ancient Near East. So this is just to put a very solid point on that that I am not grading your answers. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to open the chat now and see. Okay, great. We've got a number of answers. So Alan says birthing. That's interesting. There is. All right. So what is? I'm going to guess that that's based on a question about the relationship between the two head images there, right? So what's the deal in with the larger head and the smaller head? So Tanya says a father helping his son with a coil of rope. Wow. So father and son relationship between these two heads. That's interesting. Coil of rope. There are some right answers, Tanya, and that is actually what we learn from the Hebrew caption above this image. I'll explain more in a second. I'll actually translate it. Fertility, it's definitely related to fertility in a more indirect way. We don't know that of this as a fertility statue or a totem, as we might know of it from other African cultures. Pharaoh dad and Pharaoh kid. It is likely a Pharaoh person, and I will begin to answer this father-son relationship, child-parent relationship answer. That is a little bit too specific here, but there is a sort of hierarchical relationship. Egyptian, great, okay, yes, on the money there, father and child, Pharaoh and heir son, maybe, right? There is some hereditary, or I should say, question about inheritance here. Actually looks like a water basket, okay? Child is child, a woman caressing child in womb. Interesting, or it's a question of womb here. Mother and child. A deity assisting a woman about to give birth. That is, you're a couple chapters too early, Rabbi Zev Chaim. That's the first parsha in Shemot. This is still Vayigash, but I love that you are free associating. Not wrong, but not as accurate as what our scholars would tell us, our archaeologists and such Egyptologists. Okay, so thank God, Nels, it has nothing to as far that I know of regarding spousal abuse. However, there is a power dynamic at play here, and abusive. That is one that is in the semantic range that we need to have in mind. That this is not a fully healthy situation. Maybe benign in terms of the person who is in power. An adult figure has a bird, can't be a woman. All right, so I'm going to pause here. This is This has been great. Thank you. Please continue to use the chat box if and when you have something you would like to put to my attention. But because I'm going to be going back and forth between the text study and the chat, I won't necessarily see your responses until I take a pause in another 10 or 15 minutes. So close this and switch. So folks, what we have here, I'm going to now show you the Hebrew caption. Oops. So this is from a volume called Olam HaTanakh, the World of the Bible, which is produced by secular and religious scholars in Israel for one of their major publishing presses there. It's connected actually to Yediot Achronot. Many of you might know Yediot Achronot is one of the daily newspapers in Israel, and they have a publishing press. So it's a very popular. My secular Israeli neighbor actually has this, but another friend here in Brooklyn, his dad, who's religious, was one of the editors of this volume. And so folks read this across the spectrum in Israel. And here's what the caption says. Lefia Pasuk, according to the verse here, and we'll learn about this from our text study this morning, the giving of a fifth of the land that was arable, that was workable to Pharaoh was tied up with the specific measurement of the fields. And the work of measuring the fields in Egypt was considered very honorable, was highly honored work. And so we have a depiction of it. And what's a symbol of how honorable this was? That the representative of Pharaoh here would have used this coil, this rope, to measure fields like measuring tape we would have today. And the head of Pharaoh is like a handle. It's so the caption continues. So this is the symbol. So in the picture bit tmuna yadit chevel, the handle of this coil she'utzva kirosh adam is designed, is fashioned as the head of a person. And this person, as a number of you have seen, a resemblance between the Pharaoh's head and the human head on the coil. There's meant to be a sense that the coil is actually a stand-in for Pharaoh, who is receiving a very sizable portion of the worked land, the crops that would come out of the land. One last note here: in an earlier period, the handle would have been fashioned as the head of a deer. So it is meant to be artistic. I'm not going to comment on. I can't actually comment in the time that we have available about why they would maybe have used a deer head for the handle as opposed to a human head. But this is meant as a launching pad into a way to launch into our text study this morning. Okay. Now screen share here. Okay. Julie, you're seeing the text on your screen? Just to
No, I think you need to
still
stop
seeing
the
image.
share.
Right. Stop share. Right. Great. Thank you.
And in the meantime, I'm going to put the source sheet in the chat box.
Excellent. Good. Good segue here, friends. This is I have now taught for Julie and My Jewish Learning a few times, and I decided to take the risk of not just doing text, but also bringing you this image. But what I have never done in Zoom is actually have to switch from seeing all of your lovely faces in the gallery view to multiple documents. So thank you for your patience. And here we go. Here is the text study this morning. I'm going to begin with the end, the last text here. So you have a sense of where we're going, and especially if you have to leave early. But we will begin and end with the quote that serves as the frame for the title of this text study and for the the main passage of our Torah portion this week, for which we'll be focusing much of our time this morning. I've entitled this "Pharaohs or Slaves." Hessel, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Hessel, on Joseph, the Israelites, and us today. So scrolling down here. In 1963, the night that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Hessel first met Dr. Martin Luther King at the National Conference on Race and Religion in Chicago, this conference was timed for the first anniversary, the first centennial since the Emancipation Proclamation, and it is less than 20 years since the end of the Shoah, the end of the Holocaust, in which almost all of Rabbi Hessel's family was murdered. He barely escaped murder himself. That's a whole other story. So the convergence of these two narratives of folks who had been brutally oppressed. In his speech that evening introducing Dr. King, Rabbi Hessel said the following, among many other really gripping comments: "We are all pharaohs or slaves of pharaohs. It is sad to be a slave of a pharaoh. It is horrible to be a pharaoh. Daily, we should take account and ask, what have I done today to alleviate the anguish, to mitigate the evil, to prevent humiliation? Let there be a grain of profit in every man." So we're not going to unpack that right away. I just want you to have the frame there for how Hessel sets up what I have asserted in presenting that material previously is a known false dichotomy. He's saying to his audience, mostly clergy, first of all, folks who have some significant privilege and power, that whatever powerless they have experienced in their lives, they are in positions of power to do something. But if they are blacks or Jews, they've known oppression. And the challenge here is to know that almost all of us have experienced some power and powerlessness in our lives, some level of privilege and oppression. And one of the ways that we see how old that dynamic is, that dichotomy, and the false dichotomy that it is either or, it's actually both and, is in the final passage in the 7th aliyah of our parsha this week. And I'll read for you if you want to follow along in the Hebrew. This is Genesis 47, 20 to 27. So we have here, and this is the New Jewish Publication Society translation. Thank you to Sefaria.com. This is the first time I'm using that website to produce a text study for my Jewish learning, and there's a deep relationship between those two platforms, by the way. If you want to include Sefaria in your year-end giving, just only half joking there. So Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh, every Egyptian having sold his field because the famine was too much for them. These folks can't eat. They can barely survive. What are they going to do? They're selling their land to Pharaoh. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh, and he removed the population town by town. Okay, population transfer, internally displaced population now, from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not take over. By the way, not Israelite priests, these are Egyptian priests. For the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had made to them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Whereas I have this day acquired you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you to sow the land." Okay, so here is one of the questions that should bother you as it has bothered generations of Jews before us, and we'll see who it has bothered in particular on the next page. What does that mean? That you and your land have been acquired for Pharaoh, and what is Joseph doing here in the acquisition process? Okay, verse 24, "And when harvest comes, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh," as we saw in the caption to the image you just saw on your screen, "and 4/5 shall be yours as seed for the fields." Okay, so there's sort of a sharecropper relationship here. Maybe it's not a full-on chattel acquisition, but it's still a lot of questions here. So 4/5 shall be yours as seed for the fields and as food for you and those in your households. and as nourishment for your children. Verse 25, and they said, you have saved our lives. We are grateful to my Lord, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh. I have to pause here because that line, we shall be serfs to Pharaoh, shouldn't just perk up your ears if you recall middle school or high school history, what the feudal Europe looked like in the medieval period, what it meant for somebody to be a serf, to a vassal, to a royal, how few rights it meant that you had, and how indebted you were to the person on whose land you dwelled. But it's the Hebrew in particular that caught my eye and every time makes me pause. V'hayinu avadim leFaro. We'll see on the next page just how this resonates with other texts in our tradition. And Joseph made it into a land law in Egypt, a chok, which means a law without, this is not like tax law in the United States where there is a sunset. After a certain period, the tax law needs to be rewritten. This is meant to be a chok, a land law for all time, which is still valid, right? This isn't to say it just didn't expire. It was meant to be in perpetuity. That a fifth should be Pharaoh's. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. The priests are somehow protected. They have a shelter here. 27, here's the last and perhaps most problematic verse for us to consider. Thus Israel settled in the country of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. Not just Joseph, who was already in power, second only to Pharaoh in Egypt, but all of his kin benefit from. They grow, literally and figuratively. They increase in this dealing. They acquire holdings and are fertile and increase in their numbers. So it should give us pause there. So we see people who are that our spiritual ancestors are benefiting from this situation, a famine, and that's straight from the text. So Rashi, one of the great books of modern orthodoxy, is a series that's called "What's Bothering Rashi." One of the problems with that book is that it's often not what's bothering Rashi, it's what's bothering the people who came before Rashi, and Rashi is just an incredible editor who was well read among the generations that came after him, so well read that there is an entire genre of literature. However popular Rashi's commentaries are from the 11th century for 1,000 years forward to our time today, there is a genre of folks who comment on his commentary and comment on the commentaries thereafter. So there is a comment here. Rashi says on verse 25 above, let us find favor in the eyes of my Lord. La'asot lanu zot kamo shamarta, in that you should do for us as you have said. Okay, right. So there needs to be a mutuality here. Rashi is saying. So the finding of favor is that if we do as you're expecting, we're going to continue to work the land. We give you a fifth, and you protect us in general. Here's the social contract that we get to keep 4/5, so that we have seed to continue planting from one cycle to the next and to feed ourselves and our families. Fine. V'hayinu avadim leFaro, right? Here's this phrase that I pointed out just a minute ago. And we shall be Pharaoh's servants. And he explains, his comment on that phrase is, lahalot lo hamas hazeh b'chol shana, paying him this tax annually. Okay, so it's not really, according to Rashi, or to the folks who preceded Rashi, whose comment he is editing here, that they have become full-blown serfs. It's really very specifically just a fifth of the harvest goes to Pharaoh. And maybe the most generous reading here is Joseph is an incredible agrarian economist, and he's saying that if we take a fifth out of the harvest to protect for whether this famine is really quite long, much longer than his dream years previously, that there will be storage, there will be grain stored for the true, like if the famine worsens. Siftei Chachamim is an early modern commentator who here is quoting. This is before any kind of intellectual property law, folks. You'll see in the brackets in the middle of the next comment, Reish Aleph Mem. That's Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi. So straight up, verbatim, Siftei Chachamim is quoting one of the early commentators on Rashi. And taking the best of what Mizrahi has to say. Siftei Chachamim is a commentary you can find not just on Sefaria.com and their incredible archive. You can find it in a lot of great chumashim that include the Rashi commentary and then help the reader understand what Rashi's getting at with a little extra commentary like this. So Siftei Chachamim says on Genesis 47:25. So now commenting on the Dibur Matchil, the phrase that of Rashi here, not the phrase of the pasuk, the verse, La'asot lanu kamozot shamarta, that you may do for us as you have said. Rashi is explaining here, this is not the beginning of a new point that they were now asking to find favor in Pharaoh's eyes. Rather, Rashi knows it cannot mean this because otherwise it would not be understandable. That's a preface to saying this. Paying him this tax annually, Rashi is explaining, it does not mean that they themselves will belong to him as slaves. This is not chattel slavery, folks. For it is written before in verse 20, Yosef bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, but it does not say he bought the people. And all of this is a distillation of what the Mizrahi commentary says, what Eliyahu Mizrahi says. I'm going to pause here before we continue with parallel texts in Deuteronomy and Exodus to explain a little bit of this and how this relates to the image you saw already. So what's the relationship between that Pharaoh image and the head on that coil? What's the relationship in Hebrew between Adam and Adamah? Pharaoh is acquiring the Adamah, the land. Does it also mean in a certain sense that Pharaoh, through Joseph, is acquiring the Adam, working that land, the person working that land, somehow not engaging in some version, not just of sharecropping, but maybe even indentured servitude, of full-blown serfdom, approaching what we would call, especially in the American context, chattel slavery. That's the problem. That's what's bothering Rashi, and that's what's bothering Mizrahi, and that's what's bothering Siftei Chachamim. They are trying to say, no, don't worry, Yosef did not actually begin to institute what became the horribly oppressive, historic, like in terms of the history of humanity, pretty brutally horrible version of slavery that we know of from the building of the pyramids and from the story of Exodus. Don't worry, no, that's not what this is. This might be a prelude to that, but that's not what this is. Here's the problem. Even if it indirectly just sets up that domino effect of beginning with the best of intentions to protect the people and to protect human life by creating a nonetheless somewhat oppressive system, is there a system of power and powerlessness, a dynamic of power and powerlessness, of privilege and oppression arising here? And if so, just how culpable is Joseph? And then by extension, as the readers who are meant to, if we religiously read this text and are meant to hear this Torah as eternally relevant, what does that have to say to us today? That's the question that Hessel is putting before us when he says, we are all pharaohs or slaves of pharaohs. It is sad to be a slave of a pharaoh. It is horrible to be a pharaoh. Don't be an effing pharaoh, people. Please don't be a slave. Don't allow yourself to be a slave, but don't also, all the more importantly, ever participate in a system that would allow you to become a pharaoh or even like a pharaoh. There is no easy answer to this, especially because, again, I believe Hessel is setting up a dynamic, a false dichotomy, where it is not one or the other. It is that in the societies in which we live, we're going to experience both. Few people in their lives, please God, will only ever know powerlessness. Please God, also, few people will not ever know only privilege and only power and have that kind of completely jaded outlook on life. We're meant to be in the vicissitudes of life, experiencing both. And how then in the rest of our lives do we respond emotionally, socially and emotionally to create healthy families, communities, and societies. I'm going to have to, in the interest of time, I'll skip over. I'm not going to read the entirety of the passages that follow that provide context for us in our tradition for understanding what Rashi and Siftei Hachamim are trying to draw out of this passage, which is itself not either or, it's both and. That we see here that Joseph is doing his job. He is protecting the people he serves, but one of the people he serves is Pharaoh. He is arrogating power and wealth for Pharaoh, maybe not in a grandiose way, in a aggrandizing way, but they are using the crisis as an opportunity. In Deuteronomy, that we see that phrase, the avadim, the hayinu avadim leFaro, inverted a bit as we know it from Passover. Here in I lost my place. So anyways, Deuteronomy 6, 20 to 23, you'll recognize from the Passover Haggadah. It is quoted there. And in verse 21, we see, V'amarta levincha avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, v'yotzienu Adonai b'mitzrayim biyad chazakah. You shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. If you are like many folks, religious and secular, who read the Torah closely, it is almost impossible to ignore the similarity here. Yes, the syntax has changed, the order of the words has changed, but avadim hayinu lefaro, v'hayinu avadim lefaro, there is a resonance between Deuteronomy, a commentary within the Torah itself, right? This is Moses' final speech here, that is meant to key us up for recalling the original episode in Genesis. And then as it might have been Alan or Rabbi Zev Chaim who is thinking ahead from Vayigash to 2 weeks from now, Parashat Shemot, we see here the beginning of Exodus. This is the descent, folks, literally and figuratively. Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific, just like that last verse of this portion, where the Israelites, they acquire holdings and they're fertile and and they increase. They multiplied and increased very greatly. There's a resonance here. It's actually, if you look at the Hebrew, it is the exact same terms. So that the land was filled with them. But a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And we know the rest of that story. That king who did not know Joseph, who arises, then begins to impose harsher and harsher conditions of slavery. And here's where I believe Hessel speaks from within our tradition. This is Mishnah Pesachim 10:5. Many of you will recall this as verbatim. I've actually left off the last part of the Mishnah here, but this is quoted in full within the Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah. We read it our Seders every year, and just the second half here. In every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself or herself as though they personally had gone forth from Egypt, because it is said, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of that which the Lord, what Adonai did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. So if we turn then back to our spiritual ancestor here in the American context, the North American context, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a survivor of the Shoah, speaking to an audience of many folks who had parents or grandparents born into slavery. American blacks born into slavery, chattel slavery. folks like my mother-in-law who were born in Bergen-Belsen, who knew what brutal oppression could mean in a human context, we have to read all of this together. We are meant in every generation, every day, to be reading these Torah texts as speaking to our current lives and to how we look around us at a broken world, not just COVID, but the horrible millions and millions of people who are approaching Christmas and New Year's not knowing if they are going to be on public assistance or not, with a president who does not seem to care. Sorry, that's a political comment. I'm hoping that $2,000 is awaiting all the folks in this country who need it. I am a fan of that level of public assistance. Stepping back from that political comment, we can hear that what Hessel might say to us today about oppression, an oppressive situation, what it means for people to be on the verge of hunger, real food insecurity. We are all pharaohs or slaves of pharaohs. It is sad to be a slave of a pharaoh. It is horrible to be a pharaoh. Daily, we should take account and ask, what have I done today to alleviate the anguish, to mitigate the evil, to prevent humiliation? Let there be a grain of profit in every man. Hessel was not a politician. I'm not a politician. What I know is that if we read these texts and we recognize the humiliation, the anguish, the human anguish involved in the famine experienced in ancient Egypt, among our kin who survived the Shoah, and our cousins, our brothers and sisters here in North America, among the First Nations, as they'd say in Canada, and among the African American community who experienced generations and generations of chattel slavery. We have to understand that that anguish continues today, exacerbated by the worst public health crisis and worst unemployment crisis in 100 years. What are we doing individually, not relying upon the government? So take away my political comment of a minute ago. What are we doing individually to respond to that, to prevent humiliation, to mitigate the evil, to alleviate the anguish? And so I am not a fundraiser for My Jewish Learning. I am a professional fundraiser, and I would ask all of you to do a mitzvah, as I am preparing with my wife to do. How are we supporting food banks? How are we supporting social service and social justice organizations that are speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves because their backs are up against the wall? They barely know how to make the rent and put food on the table for their families. And unfortunately, they don't know how politicians are going to help them do it. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. Please, in the next week, consider how, whatever your capacity is, and maybe you have more time than shekels available, and that's fine. But please consider, as my wife and I've been out of work, full-time work, since late spring. And I am grateful to My Jewish Learning for the opportunities to extend some of my Torah to all of you about monthly or every 6 weeks, to say, I think it is incumbent, I know as a rabbi, that it is incumbent upon all of us to be asking the questions that Rabbi Hessel is forcing his audience in 1963, and please God for us today in 2020, on the cusp of 2021, to be asking. I did not pause in the middle of the classes I usually do. I apologize for that. If you are not having to jump off at this time, I'm happy to take a look at some of your comments in the chat box. Julie, do we have a minute or two to if you've been following the chat,
Yes,
to see if there's anything to unpack?
There are. Thank you so much, Rabbi Andy Shugerman, and for everyone for being here at this session. There are some questions in the chat box if you want to take a peek, and we do have a few minutes if you are willing and if folks are able to stay for Rabbi Andy to address some of those questions.
Great.
Some are comments, some are questions. Great.
So I'm going to try to focus on the questions, folks. I'm sure that a lot of your comments are really, I'm sure there's significance there. When the Egyptians were moved off the land, where did they go? That's a great question. The Torah does not address that. What we do know is from the first chapter of Exodus, that when eventually the same kind of internal displacement happens for the Israelites, they are forced to build cities for themselves. Pitom v'Ra'amses. Ra'amses, there's a lot of ink spilled over that. Why is there an intended correlation, resonance between Ra'amses and Ramses, the pharaoh? Was that meant to be a town sort of, or a dwelling in honor of him, or perhaps some in a sort of perverted way, in honor of his oppression? We don't have a clear answer. The Torah is making its own case in terms of, as Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory would say, as a religious anthropology. It is not meant as a work of archaeology. So that's a question that's been debated. Okay. If you own the land, you own the people that work it, right? Okay. In verse 19, the people. I'm looking for questions. Right, so just a comment that I'll take as a question. I'm reading Cast and how the Bible was used to justify slavery. What we know is that there is a version of slavery. It is not chattel slavery. It is not owning the whole person. Slaves in biblical law had real rights. A slave could lose those rights when coming up against the limitation of slavery, which was more akin to what we would know from the colonial American period of institution of indentured servitude, of 7 years of servitude to the person who had paid the way for that person to come across the Atlantic. If they declined to go free, then in Exodus, in Parashat Mishpatim, they would have an earring. They would get a gauge put through their ear in order to make it very plainly known to the entire community that they had decided to stay with their master, with their not their owner, by the way. This was not full-blown ownership, but that they had foregone certain rights in order to keep shelter with that family. See. Again, looking for questions. So just to be very clear about the extent to which, yes, slavery is known within the biblical period, within biblical law even, but it is not what we would think of as slavery in the American context. Torah only allows a person for 7 years. Right, there you go. There's the comment sort of backing up what I just said. Does providing for less fortunate members of your family count as a mitzvah? Yes, especially when considering one of the challenges that the Jewish tradition has seen across our history. How do we define family? Are we looking at the human family? Are we looking at only other Jews? And if we're only looking at other Jews, at what point do we begin asking people to show us their talis and tefillin, as it were? To say, what kind of Jew are you? Do you go to shul on Shabbos? Do you keep kosher? Is there a litmus test for what it means to be family? And that, yes, that I'm making that comment somewhat tongue-in-cheek and somewhat caustically. I'm not saying that there is a right way and a wrong way to police our boundaries. I am highlighting that that is a real challenge. That a totally universalistic approach means that we are not necessarily caring for the folks with whom we live, whether literally because they're family or figuratively because we share some spiritual or even genetic shared ties. What's the right balance here between a tribal framework from which we come and the more 21st century universalistic, almost boundlessness, which has become so in vogue and has been so challenging to many people who have begun to put up walls again in our own community and elsewhere. I don't have a good answer for that, but other than that, the answer is yes. Depending on how you define family, yes, it is still a mitzvah, but you can't get off on only supporting your family. That doesn't mean that every person panhandling or busking on the street needs to get a buck. one of the great challenges of the rabbinic tradition is showing how our ancient sages disagreed, like passionately disagreed about how to perform the mitzvah of tzedakah, to whom you give and how much you give and under what conditions. No pat answers. There's no simple answer here, other than give. If you don't give, you're not a nice person. You're not doing it right. There is a way to do it wrong, folks. There isn't necessarily a right way, but there is a wrong way. Okay, let's come in for landing with maybe one or last two comments. Is privilege a form of slavery for those that do not have the privilege in society? I'm not sure I quite understand the question, Michael, but I would say yes, if I understand you correctly. Yes, having privilege. I will say this. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and one of my classmates was a woman known as Chelsea Clinton. She was a year behind me. She's wicked smart, as they say in Boston. Clearly, and we know she has gone on, not just the child of two Yale Law School graduates, but she went to Oxford and Stanford, and she didn't just get there because of her last name. But she has lived a life where she was constantly scrutinized because of who her parents were, maybe also because of her own choices. And one of the reasons why I know through friends that she married Mark Mezvinsky, this great Jewish guy, as I hear, he's apparently a lovely guy. His dad and mom were very public figures. His dad went to prison. His dad went to federal prison for tax fraud, tax evasion, something like that. His mom lost her second race for Congress. She was wiped out in the Republican Revolution of 1994. I mention this because these are two folks who have actually been very, and again, I'm not in contact with these folks. I've not spoken to Chelsea since my high school graduation, but I know through mutual friends that they have been very careful about the extent to which they live in the public eye. Their parents made certain choices, and they have felt the oppressiveness of a very media-oriented society. They did not choose to be born into these families. They did not choose to be very privileged, but they can use their privilege because of wealth and fame to set certain boundaries for themselves. That's just one very awkward example I would use. I apologize if any of you are actually closer to Mark and Chelsea than I am these days, if that was inappropriate. But I think it's a good way of saying, yes, nobody is safe in a society where there is a diametrically opposed kind of false dichotomy of power and powerlessness, privilege and oppression. If we instead respond as Rabbi Hessel asks of us, exhorts us to consider that we must respond with compassion and with the utmost of empathy and action to protect each other from humiliation and from the evil of anguish, imposed anguish, not merely, what's happening for you internally, but through the vicissitudes of life, but actual societal oppression, then that's the ultimate message. I'm going to close here. It is now 1:15. I teach for half an hour, and then the last 15 minutes are free. Thank you for having given me a little extra time, folks. I really appreciate this opportunity, and back to Julie.